Yo, what's up? We're going to be doing today, we have the 10.1 M plus DPS tier list, long awaited. So as it currently stands, M plus testing has only been on the weekends. There's been a decent amount of M plus testing. I've done testing of all of the dungeons. I've tested with a bunch of different specializations. We've gotten data and asked a bunch of different players what they thought about some specs and stuff like that for some of the things that are lacking. At the end of the day, this is ultimately an M plus tier list. We're not going to be right about everything. I think that we have a significantly better than average estimation and prediction on what is going to be meta for M plus this season. But as class tuning happens, as balance happens, things are going to change over the course of the whole entire season. Of course, we are going to be continuously updating our tier lists on Wowhead as well. So make sure if you were looking at this and it's like three months down the road, you should go check out the written guide as things might have changed with 10.1.5 or whatever.
Yeah, Blizzard has been doing a pretty good job of doing frequent balance tuning, although usually it's the raid profiles that they make sure to really get close. I would say M plus though. You look at 10.0, M plus DPS, like 10 different specs were showing up in the top runs on the front page of Radar.io. This is a very diverse season. It is worth noting this list is for high keys as well. We're not looking at what's going to be best in like a weekly 15, a weekly key like that, because there are some specs that are going to do differently in those. Specs with ramp up time will do a little bit better. Yeah, something like a Fury Warrior, or we'll do a little bit worse, right? And something like a Fury Warrior with upfront damage, although you're going to die to getting auto attacked if your tank doesn't have an AoE taunt on full when you pop all your cooldowns. But anyways, the point is that there's a different set of stuff that's good in the lower keys. And also, we're really trying to talk about the game at a level where your gear is close to maxed, your skill is close to maxed, and we're designing comps to try and be the best they could possibly be. For most players, up to and including people near the very top, being comfortable with the spec you're playing a spec you're going to enjoy are by far the most important things to do. But for some of us, it's fun to talk about, what is good and bad and why different things are favored or falling out of favor and what the kind of balance is looking like. So that's the purpose of this video. Do not use it for the wrong stuff.
I think in 10.0 as well, I mean, just kind of reiterating on that, in 10.0, it was definitely one of the most open metas that you've ever seen in regards to what was and wasn't able to be brought. And that, I think, comes generally off the back of like the talent tree reworks and some of those changes. In addition to that, you need to have a balanced composition. I think that that's like something that is lost on people. You look at like specs in certain ranges. At the end of the day, you need to have a balanced composition, have enough stops, have enough interrupts, that kind of thing. That's what I mean whenever I'm talking about balanced composition. So let's talk about what we are ranking these specs off of. S tier is typically meta-defining specializations in some capacity. You are likely to see one of these in every single composition. It is highly preferred. Now, it is not mandatory in all spots because it's not always going to be mandatory, but these are things that we typically tend to believe are going to define the meta game at a high level. A tier is generally going to be, if we don't have anything in S, it's going to be your first or second DPS slot. If we have stuff in S, it's generally going to be like the second to third DPS slot range. Just the things that help support either the best DPS of the season or are just generally very universally strong. B tier is typically your third DPS slot range specs. While they might not be bad in some instances, they aren't going to be one of the specs that you're like always clamoring to see. They're not going to be the absolute tip top best in every single spot, but they are still going to be good, and you're likely to see them in some of the top runs occasionally, but just it's not something that people are willing to reroll to in spades, that kind of thing. C tier specs are, I would say, generally specs that you're not thrilled with. Like you do see them sometimes. Maybe they have a niche that is quite potent. Maybe they can be brought in very specific instances, but we think that it is unlikely to see them. And then D tier is something that we would be surprised to see.
Yeah, I think of these tiers, D is the only one where it's like, and maybe a little bit of C where it's like, wow, this spec really needs some buffs for like its M plus damage profile. And credit to Blizzard, those tiers have been pretty sparsely populated, I think, over the past couple of patches, which has been good.
C and D also end up having issues of like different spec in their class cannibalizes their ability to be able to even be seen. That's also something that you have to work with a little bit,
right? Which it's always a hard thing to do when making these tier lists, right? Is when you're talking about like the second or third best specs of a given class. So definitely always take those with a grain of salt. It's oftentimes the second or third best version of a class. It looks a lot better or a lot worse on the stats than it actually is because like all the good players are playing the best spec, right? And it makes them look a lot less bad than they actually are on their own merits in like absolute terms.
Okay, so let's start it off. And we can start off by talking about the Death Knight class. So we have Unholy and Frost Death Knight. I don't know how much has changed from 10.0 with how I feel about these specializations. Unholy was this niche spec that ended up excelling in very specific circumstances. We even saw it in spades in like the MDI. But once you started to get to like high key levels where groups weren't pulling as large as they were in the MDI, Unholy then started to fall off. However, the Death Knight class, just in general, is one that it's probably the tankiest class in the game, I would say, with things such as 20% health nodes and AMS and things like that, Death Strike. And so that's definitely something that you have to factor in. Their damage seems like it's okay, but it's not something that's like, oh my god, it's blowing all these other specializations out of the water. I think that Frost DK in general has an issue of like, whenever Breath of Syndragos is their best build, it's difficult for them to be like a top tier spec. Like I just Breath doesn't work super well for how M+ is played. And then on top of that, I think that Unholy is in a similar spot where it's like, it's pretty good, but it's like super niche at what it's good at. And so I would put them both in B. That's kind of where I'm ranging here.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see Unholy showing up in the MDI again this time around. I think that spec is likely to still be pretty good at those sorts of situations. A great power infusion recipient as well, which can be nice, especially if you got spare those floating around, although there are a lot of good specs receiving that. And yeah, like you said, Frost, especially if Breath of Syndragosa is what you're trying to play in keys, it is really, really high risk for relatively low reward in keys. Because like,
yes,
your tank just doesn't pull the next pack or something, or you drop breath because you get targeted by some mechanic or whatever. And if you drop your breath 30 seconds early or something like that, like it is over. It is despair for the next 2 minutes for you. So the way they've changed around breath a little bit into this patch has made it a little bit less feast or famine, but it's still, I think, a spec that is very a lot of squeeze for not very lot of juice in M+.
If they had like an Obliterate build or like a Frost Scythe build.
Yeah, and those builds also are better than they have been in previous seasons. Yes. But still, I think B is probably the best place to tier this, especially given how strong some of the other specs are.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about Havoc Demon Hunter. I think that Havoc Demon Hunter, they're losing a lot of power. Their tier set for this next tier doesn't look particularly compelling. On top of that, they nerfed their Vault of the Incarnates tier set because they were saying that they were willing to wear that. On top of that, they recently got buffed, which is nice. And it does seem like this is a tier where casters are quite strong. And that's something we're going to continue to talk about later. I think Havoc has its place in a composition, but I think that Havoc has its place as like generally going to be like the third DPS slot in compositions. That's why I'm tending to lean a little bit more towards B. It does bring Chaos Brand. It does bring a decent amount of stops. They are unkillable versus rot style damage, but susceptible to dying to 100 to 0 one-shots that come out at frequent paces, which can become issues as the season progresses. That probably won't be an issue early on, but they are susceptible to dying to like 100 to 0 one-shots. I generally put them in B. I think that the Chaos Brand almost on its own is enough to have them there.
Yeah, Chaos Brand, it's a little bit less of a big deal than it is in Raid, right? Like if you're trying to do a Raid boss without Chaos Brand, you're just trolling. But here it just means that like even if the specs damage is mid, when you factor in the Chaos Brand, they're probably doing okay.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably where it lands here. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if most groups don't play with a Havoc DH, but I definitely don't think it would be bad to play one, yeah.
I mean, it has like we're going to talk about wizard comps here in a little bit, but it has like a short CD interrupt. It has a lot of utility in forms of stops and stuff like that with Cage and, Nova and stuff like that. So I think it's good, but ultimately, I don't think its damage is pushing it towards that A or S tier because utility alone is not enough more often than not to carry a specialization.
Yeah, again, nothing wrong with the spec. Absolutely works in the solid B tier, but nothing. There are some specs that are doing a lot more, basically, is what we think.
Yeah. All right. So we got Balance and Feral. Both of these specs bring Mark of the Wild, which is probably the best. If it's not the best buff in M+, it's close.
It's really close.
Yeah, 3% damage and 1.5% DR for the whole entire party is never something to really be scoffed at. It definitely makes groups at a higher end a lot easier. That and Fortitude, I think, are the ones that are like noticeable whenever you have them in your group versus not. I think that we're going to continue to see a trend where both Balance and Feral are in A tier due to the amount of damage that they're able to provide. Now, Feral, I don't think we're going to end up seeing too many of, for similar reasons that we didn't see too many of them in 10.0. While their AoE damage is strong, their single target damage is a little bit lackluster, but just not very many people played them. Balance, kind of a similar situation. Single target damage, not that great. AoE damage, especially for sustain, pretty good. And whenever it's matched with things such as a Shadow Priest, it then starts to look quite good.
Yeah, the balanced druid kit of utility remains quite strong in M plus, right? Like you're
Yeah.
still just doing a lot of nice things that help out the group, and then whenever your overall damage is also quite good, which balances will be, that's really nice. And Feral is quite good damage. It's received some changes from 10.0 where it was obviously like, I mean, Feral damage and keys in 10.0 and the 10.0 cycle was very good. I think it will still be quite good though. And absolutely a worthy melee to include in your runs. Yeah, not a lot of people play this back, but
Yeah.
of those that do, they're finding a lot of success this expansion in keys, and I think they will continue in 10.1.
I mean, on top of that, the Druid class in general has a decent amount of utility versus. So Blizzard is changing caster mobs in M plus a lot to where whenever you commit an AoE stop, they don't recast immediately, and that actually benefits the Druid class with things such as Typhoon, such as Incapacitating Roar. As with Feral, you can like even like maim stun if you have that talented. You don't always have that talented, but like you can potentially maim stun and stuff like that. And so that's something that does bring value to the Druid class as well. Just the ability to have multiple AoE stops, forecasts, and help facilitate some stuff. Okay, Dev Evoker. I think that this spec is going to be underrated, but I want it in A. Where do you feel?
Yeah, I think the spec is really, really good. I think Sleeper really, really, really good. The spec does so much damage. Again, another great PI recipient.
Yeah, that's true.
A lot of survival, like the survivability kit, 2 charges of Obsidian Scales, and Renewing Blaze and M plus, like are really, really, really good as well.
You can cauterize your tank.
I just think this spec is fantastic for both raid and M plus damage.
Yeah, on top of that, you can also run Cauterizing Wound, which you can utilize on bleeds and stuff like that. I think overall, Dev's utility is okay. They have things such as Tail Swipe and Wing Buffet. It's good. It's good utility. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not like the best utility I've ever seen from like a caster. On top of that, Quell can be a fairly long duration if you don't talent it down. Dev is going to be an A, but it's going to be an A based almost solely off of damage.
So this season is one where I think you're going to be able to get away with a couple of long kicks on your team, because not for the DPS reasons, but because your tank and healer, if you're going to bring something like a prop paladin and or a resto shaman, which I think are both looking really solid for this season, those add a lot of flexibility because Avenger's Shield interrupts, Resto Shaman's Wind Shear. A lot of healers, actually, all the non-priest healers can potentially have a kick as well, but Resto Shaman's is the shortest, and the Resto Druid getting a kick, for instance, requires some work, right? And that's something they're not necessarily always going to be able to easily do on a given pull, but Resto Shamans always can, right? I guess Preservation Evokers can, but it's the long kick.
Holy Paladin looks also quite strong with some of the changes that they've done to their damage, and like Rebuke being also a short CD is very good.
I think that creates space for specs, for multiple copies of specs like Dev Evoker, because there have been previous seasons where it's like, oh, we can't actually play 2 ranged because we won't have enough kicks, right? I don't think this is going to be one of those seasons, basically.
Okay, Beast Mastery Hunter. I'll let you guys in on a little secret. This is the only spec I had ranked in D. Now, their tier set kind of sucks. They were medium to okay in 10.0, but I think that they're getting a decent bit worse in 10.1 on the AoE department. On top of that, like one of the big advantages of BM Hunter in 10.0 was the fact that they had some of the highest single target damage in the game in M+. That continued to get nerfed over and over again because Blizzard did not like that aspect of them. And so I think that this spec is kind of getting left in the dust coming into 10.1. It's also like the lowest simming spec in the game, which isn't always like a major red flag, but it's certainly not something that you want to have happening.
Yeah, I do think we put this spec in D tier last time as well, and they ended up being fine.
We had them in B. We had them in B. We had MM and Serve in D, but then they buffed the hell out of both.
MM was the one we had in D and ended up being fine, right?
But they buffed it. But yes.
Okay,
they buffed it and reworked heavy ammo and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down for this for BM. I've also not been super impressed with what it's looked like on PTR, but again, I will say, like, I do think there's a reasonable chance that if we're right about it, they will buff it somewhat, because there's this case where sometimes there are these specs where it's like, oh, this looks bad for M+, but it looks good for raid, so it's going to be hard for Blizzard to buff it. And if we're right about BM, we also think it's going to be bad in raid, which means it should be a prime recipient of some buffs pretty early into the season, if we're right about those things.
Next up, we got Serve Hunter. Kind of a similar situation to 10.0. If you remember Serve at the end of Shadowlands, it was a spec that like a lot of their damage was Wildfire Bomb. A lot of it was just like passive cleave with just throwing as many Wildfire Bombs as possible. As it currently stands, how Serve ends up functioning is a lot of their damage is just single target. A lot of their damage is baked into like things such as like Mongoose Bite, which is not exactly the greatest thing for an M plus build. Whenever your most redeeming quality is your Mongoose Bite single target damage. Wildfire Bomb, kind of I don't say a meme ability, but it's just doing a lot less damage than it would need to for this spec to see play in any reasonable capacity in M plus. I think that overall, additionally, their utility is probably the worst utility in all of M+, just the Hunter class in general. I mean, that's one of the reasons that BM is also down in D, is just the Hunter class in general has some of the worst utility in the game.
Yeah, like you're not bringing a buff to help the group, right? You got your wacky little owl with its like 5% leech for the party or whatever, but
yeah,
that's not really doing much. And then, you know, there are some spots where Hunter can do some of the same stuff that like rogues and mages can do with Invis, you know, the like Invis vanish stuff you can do with Feign as well. But for the most part, it's a class that kind of needs to be doing some sick damage to be really worthy of inclusion. And it doesn't quite look like it's there right now. And like you said, like the AoE side of things does seem to be the side that is weaker with the current way the spec is being built, and especially with the recent nerfs to the set bonus.
Yeah, exactly. It's just built in a way that's not conducive to being uber successful in M+ in a way that Serve would have to just be doing above and beyond the best damage for you to be like, oh yeah, this is a spec that I'm willing to play with over and over again. Because I mean, dude, if they would just like rework that binding shot nerf, that would actually do so much good for them too.
Yeah,
like there's like a lot that's going on. All right, next up we got MM, and I think MM is their damage is good. I think it's good enough to put them in B. I don't think their utility is great, but I don't think we need multiple Hunter specs in C and one in D. I think it's a situation where MM is good enough to be a third DPS slot for a decent amount of groups.
Yeah, it just seems like the best way the best Hunter spec for doing damage, and it seems like it does do quite a lot of damage right now.
Yeah.
So enough to justify an inclusion in a lot of cases. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna bring the Shadow Priest up because I think that this is a spec that we probably needed to talk about a little bit earlier because of how good it is. This is, if we have multiple S tier specs, this is definitely the best S tier spec. It has some of the highest AoE damage in the game, if not the highest AoE damage in the game. On top of that, the utility that it provides is unmatched in the forms of Power Word Fortitude is quite good. They're unkillable. And Mass Dispel in very specific spots and Offensive Purge is, I would almost say, mandatory. First boss of Halls of Infusion is one that I can think of that almost right off the rip. In addition to that, the Dragons in Halls of Infusion, Mass Dispel is also very good for that. Uldamon last boss, MD, is with how the Wing Buffet works on that boss with
Dude,
the
and
overlap.
the Time Reavers before the last boss as well.
The Time Reavers and the Basilisks with the Thorns cast. I mean, you can kick that, but you can also just offensive purge it off. I think that Shadow really has like a lot of good things going for it. On top of that, it helps. Power Infusion is absolutely just broken in M+ with how much damage it provides to other specializations. And then Shadow, just on its own merits alone, I think I would have made a case for it to be an S, and then it has Power Infusion plus Fort on top of it, and you're like, okay, this is a meta-defining specialization. I think that people are likely to reroll to this spec if it continues to stay in the same state. They did just recently nerf their AoE, but was not by enough to make me second guess whether or not Shadow is an S.
Yeah, this spec, so it's got a big rework coming into 10.1. When the rework was first announced, it was basically like, hey, we're getting rid of Mindseer and like your Insanity Gen is going way down. But then they kind of made it better over the next couple of tweaks to it. And now it looks like it's still, just going to be great in AoE.
I was going to say, on top of that, like Afflicted and Incorporeal, Shadow has the ability to be able to stop both of those new affixes as well reliably. I mean, it's not something that we talked about with the other classes. The Druids also have the ability to be able to do that. But Afflicted and Incorporeal, with the Poison Dispel for Afflicted and Shackle Undead for Incorporeal, it just makes it valuable every single week. Like, why wouldn't we have this? There's also like bursting weeks and stuff like that where Mass Dispel is also just miles better than everything else.
Yeah, it is a hugely powerful spec. It can live like the combination of like just dispersion, close to an immunity. VE a little bit relatively nerfed with the 25% player health monster damage change.
VE also just got nerfed, but yeah.
Yeah, and also the nerf on top of that. So, but still very powerful button. That button was much more powerful than it had any right to be, and is still going to be quite good. So yeah, I mean, I think you don't have to play one of these if you're playing a healing priest, but I don't see a reason why you really would not want to. And even if you are playing a healing priest, one of these will still be a very welcome addition to the team.
It is a weird spot of healing priest. I mean, it seems like people are really happy with the state of disc and how that's going to operate in M+.
Yeah.
And I mean, would that really take away from the shadows spot? I'm not even sure, but
I think you can definitely play both, but if you're playing the healing priest, I don't think you have to play the shadow.
I agree.
But I do think a lot of groups will play both, or will just play the shadow and then get their lust or their B-res or whatever from their healer.
Okay, next up we got the Mage trio with Fire, Arcane, and Frost. And I think let's first off talk about what is projected to be the best Mage specialization in Fire. Now, Fire recently got a little bit of single target buffs, and then they came back and nerfed Ignite a little bit. Fire is a spec that is projected to do a decent bit more damage in 10.1 M+ than it was doing in 10.0 M+. And it honestly, as the course of 10.0 progressed, Fire became better and better. On top of that, whenever you match that with things such as Power Infusion, Fire like normally tops meters. It is a spec that is quite good. Dratnos and I, before we started recording, had a conversation for maybe 5 minutes talking about, does Fire deserve to be an S or the very top of A? We think we landed at the top of A.
Yeah, I think that was mostly me that wanted it top of A rather than S, because it seems like probably the best option among these kind of A tier specs of like, hey, this is a great choice to include, but a little bit less of a like meta defining thing than Shadow Priest we think is going to be. But I wouldn't be surprised if we were wrong about that either. I think it's definitely, it looks really, really, really good. Yeah.
On top of that, it also, again, with Afflicted and Incorporeal, has the ability to be able to decurse or polymorph the Incorporeal or Afflicted mobs, which is, I think, going to be a big deal if you want to play every single week. You're going to need at least have a comp that can manage in some capacity, or at least have the ability to be able to help out your healer. And so Fire, I mean, just a Mage in general can do that. I think that Mage is also pretty well-rounded. Fire is the tankiest of the Mage specializations. Okay, so the talent cauterize, like with things, I think that Fire is normally the tankiest of the Mage specializations. You can make an argument for Frost.
It's like a 2% damage loss or something to take cauterize, so that may be worth. But the mages I know are cringing at that choice.
Okay, Frost, I have this in B. I think that Frost actually saw a decent amount of play in 10.0. I suspect it's still going to be pretty good. I think that this is just a situation where it's going to get outshined by Fire by enough of an amount this season to where you are not necessarily like jumping for joy to see a Frost Mage. I think that Fire is certainly occupying like a second DPS slot, whereas Frost would more often than not occupy like a third. Frost was seen for things like like Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, things where boss damage was by far the most important element in M+, or low target cleave, that kind of thing. Now, how relevant it's going to be is yet to be seen, but I think that this is mostly looking like a B tier spec.
I think Frost is going to be one of those specs where you see this on B tier here, but I do think that like, especially among, in the lower keys, in the keys where you know less about like what your tank is going to pull before they actually pull it.
Oh yeah.
Frost does really well in that situation. It's
oh yeah.
You do want your tank to kind of be chain pulling. That's something that Frost mages do struggle with, but it is nice that it's got kind of a consistent damage pattern. It works well if your tank is doing what high key tanks don't do, because in high keys you're supposed to do, big pull, relax for a little bit, big pull, relax for a little bit, right? Like that's kind of the high key pattern, and Frost isn't especially good at that because its damage just kind of always there. You want to burst to your class for that. But if you're just kind of always fighting one pack at a time, Frost is pretty happy in that case, and that can be something that makes this feel pretty different than what you'll experience in the lower keys potentially.
Okay, next up we have Arcane Magician. And Arcane, I think, is a specialization that it is difficult to operate and pilot well in dungeons, and I think that it is almost solidly the third best mage spec, which is why I would lobby for it to be in C. Now, I think it's a spec that can see play in Raid generally. I think that it is rather good in Raid, and so I think that you might see it some, but I don't think it is even the second best mage specialization for M+ as it currently stands. I don't know. It's just one of those things that like the way that they deal damage with, Arcane Power, with Touch of the Magi, with all their cooldowns, if they mess up one singular thing, their damage is kind of scuffed. It's just not conducive to optimal gameplay unless the spec is meta defining, I think.
Yeah, it's like this, it kind of has to be doing really a lot more damage than Fire. Like the ceiling has to be a lot higher to justify how hard it is to play around and set it up, and how vulnerable it is to being disrupted, right? And we just don't think that that's going to be true this season. I think last season, even when Arcane, like at the start of the season, when Arcane was super duper broken, right? It was still not like even...
Oh, mages hated it, and they were playing Frost and stuff like that too.
Yeah, exactly. Like you still wouldn't see a lot of mages using it in keys, although I do think that like theoretically it probably was correct to be doing it if you were like, trying to push the very highest possible keys that early in the season, but people really weren't. So I do think it's still a good expansion to be playing Arcane. If you love Arcane Mage, I think it's a good expansion to be playing it, and I think that this is something you can have a lot of fun doing. But I would be surprised if it was like the pick of top mages and top keys.
Yeah. Okay, next up we got Windwalker Monk. This is a spec that looked like it was actually very good coming into 10.0. Now I got a couple of AoE nerfs here and there. The story of Windwalker Monk is that their AoE has been good. Their single target has looked just god awful and in every single spot over the course of the whole entire expansion. Defensively though, they're probably one of the tankiest specs in the game. And on top of that, their utility is quite strong. So I think that it's like it would never slip down to C tier just off the basis of can't die and good utility, but I'm not like thrilled to play with one either.
Yeah, when you talk about Windwalkers who like can't die, it's interesting because I feel like a medium skilled Windwalker dies a lot more often than a medium skilled person of random spec.
Demon Hunter?
It's the spec. Yeah, it's just like you have these abilities where you're, like you have to be really up close and personal with the mobs, and like all of your defense is active buttons, right? Like you don't have a lot of passive self-healing. You don't have a lot of passive DR. You just have like 5 cooldowns that you can't die if you press any of them. But you do have to actually press one of them to avoid dying. Now, that means that when it's played well, of course, it looks really good. But it is worth noting that your experience, again, may vary depending on what exactly kind of key you're doing.
Okay, next up we got Ret Paladin. 10.0.7 rework for Ret Paladin. Quite good. I think that this made this specialization into one where their damage seems like it's there. Dungeon utility from Paladin, just the class in general, is always one that's like been pretty solid. Plus, Sanctified Plates has to be one of the most broken talents I've ever seen.
That one's kind of just like a...
That's not the active button that we were talking about just a second ago.
Yeah, that's the talent that's like armor increased by 10%, damage from area of effect, abilities reduced by 10% or whatever, stamina increased by 10%, something like that. And it's just a note on the Paladin class tree.
What's the passive
It reminds
shield?
me of you like read a Hearthstone card from 10 years ago, and it's like, yeah, dude, I'm a 4 mana 4/4, and then you read one from today, and it's like, yeah, I'm a 4 mana, and then there's just like a book of abilities or whatever. You're just like, oh my god, that thing is so much better. It seems super power crept compared to other talents from like the 10.0 versus 10.0.7 timeline.
I would generally be wanting to put this probably like the bottom of A. I think that we're entering like a caster centric meta, but I think that this is a situation where Ret Paladin's damage is solid enough to where I think that it is worth putting them a bit higher in the tier list, especially, I mean, in the same tier as A. Now, are they going to be doing the same damage as Fire Mage? Probably not. But at the same point, I do think that they have value in that potentially second to third DPS slot. I think that you shouldn't be shocked to see them in top compositions in top dungeons. As a spec is good. I mean, it's really tanky now, and on top of that, the damage that it provides is quite strong. Utilities,
Devo Aura or Ret Aura, both good as well.
Yeah.
If you have another like if you're playing a prop paladin, you can still get the other one as well out of your Ret Pally. It's it's always nice when you have a spec that is bringing that little bit of utility, and the combination of like bop, sack, bubble. These are actually really useful for a lot of high key effects as well. And not to mention the off healing, like lay on hands. And if you have a paladin that is using those buttons well, there's just many opportunities to save lives in every single dungeon.
In high keys, sack from Ret Paladin specifically is a button that gets used on your tank very frequently, and then whenever there are one-shots that are approaching, the Ret Paladin is totally fine on his own, and he can sack somebody else and help them live. It is that the utility that the Ret Paladin provides for just the group utility is very nice to have.
All right, what we got next?
Rog, which is probably the most broken class in the history of existence, but kind of looks like a stinker this tier for whatever reason, but it's not due to the reasons that you would always anticipate.
Yeah, so there hasn't been a season where Rogue hasn't been either the best choice or a great choice for M+.
Yes.
Right? Like it's really rare to find a season where top groups would laugh at you for playing a Rogue. There's some where it's like, oh, this group thinks Rogue is bad, but this group thinks Rogue is good, right? Like that is the worst that it really has ever gotten for Rogue. And I think we're kind of going to be likely entering a season like that, where some groups are going to play rogues and some groups are not going to play rogues. Rogue is still just brings a tremendous amount of utility. There are some shrouds that are pretty nice in a lot of these dungeons as well, but you can get around that with, the potion CD change thing. The invis pots are also just a fine way to navigate these dungeons if you don't have a rogue. So it's not like they're mandatory. They do bring an awful lot of control. That technology you mentioned about mobs not doing their casts at the same time as each other is a big change in Dragonflight, and Rogue actually is a beneficiary of that because it has a bunch of single target stops, but not very many AoE stops.
Yep.
So the AoE stop, whenever there's 4 mobs that do like piercing shards in Azure Vault, for instance, there are ones of these in the newer dungeons as well. Rogue is really good at handling that because it can just stop 6 of those in a row, whereas an AoE stop that could normally stop 4 casts if they were simultaneous can only stop 1 because they don't cast at the same time. So Rogue still brings a huge amount of control. The damage, though, is what we're a little bit worried about for this spec or for this class, right? So what's the spec we think is going to be the best here?
I believe it's going to be Outlaw as it currently stands. So Outlaw has had, over the course of the PTR, their tier set has varied between, them doing 4x the amount of damage and pulling every single mob I've ever seen inside of a dungeon, to then it got unbug fixed and now it's doing 4 times less the amount of damage that it's supposed to do. I think their 2 set's still bugged, according to some rogues that I was talking to about this, because I was trying to figure out like what the situation with the rogue bugs are. It seems like it's going to be Outlaw at its current state. Sin recently got buffed, and so I think that I would generally lobby to put Sin in B just due to the rogue utility, because rogue is one of those classes that I think is perennially the best in M+. More often than not, Garrote Silence is also very good. If you're playing with a Preservation Evoker or Devastation Evoker, if you Oppressive Roar into a Garrote Silence, you're locking down the mobs for a very long period of time, and that's something that you need to work out in advance. And then Sub, funnily enough, is where I have in C, and I have some notes as to why. And if you look at this, these are bugs that are currently documented with Subtlety as it currently stands. And this is a spec that I don't want people to watch this tier list and then they see the meta 2 months later and then be like, wait, everybody's playing Sub, why? As it currently stands, Sub's damage sucks. They apparently fixed Night Stalker, but it's not completely fixed.
I'm pretty sure there's been multiple patch notes where they say they fixed this thing and it hasn't yet.
It's still not fixed. And
yeah,
Sub's damage,
I'm sure at some point they'll get it right. But yeah.
Sub's damage sucks because of, they got nerfed a couple of times. It's like a tier set thing. On top of that, there's some stuff that's bugged with them. And then it's just like they're just undertuned. It's like a combination of a bunch of different things. That's why I'm putting them in C. It's funny to see a rogue spec in C because we had multiple of them in A last time. But
yeah, and again, like bug fixes and potentially slight tuning, and all of a sudden Sub could be the rogue spec of choice, right? Like
that's why I'm really hitting this like asterisk. You watch out for this spec. I mean, it could get fixed. It could be fine.
It's weird. Like, it's not like these are new issues. These are ones that have been flagged during the whole PTR cycle, but sometimes those sorts of things just get flagged during the whole PTR cycle, but don't actually end up getting fixed until later. So yeah. Definitely be on the lookout for patch notes that resolve these problems for Sub.
Next up, we got the Shamans. I got both of the Shaman brothers in A. Never thought I'd see the day where I have both Ellie and it.
Yeah. So let's start by talking about Ellie, because Ellie in Raid was one where I had to like talk you down to C for Ellie in Raid, because I just like, look, man, the single target, it's just not exciting enough to justify like a non-raid buff spec.
Okay.
But wow, the AoE on this spec is phenomenal. And the M+ damage profile of this spec is phenomenal. Like, the spec is looking like it's going to just do a lot of damage in keys. It is a caster that has the benefits of being a caster for the purposes of like, hey, I don't have to stand next to mobs. I get to be nice and far away and safe and happy. It has a relatively robust defensive suite. It has AG still, although, slightly weaker than AG was in the previous patch. It has a curse dispel for afflicted. It has a couple of good ways to interact with incorporeal, although it's not a premier incorporeal doer, but it is pretty good. You can talent some ways to be very good at that.
Yeah, sure, talent hex.
Yeah, just talent hex and cast it. Like, it's not the end of the world. So basically, it's kind of got the best of both worlds. It's got the short kick as well, right? So like in a caster meta, a caster with a short kick fits really well into that, if we're right about that being what you're kind of looking for this season. So all of those things make Ellie look really like a really great choice for M+, especially for Fort Week.
I would say the weaknesses of the Elemental Shaman just in general, it tends to be their defensive suite, while it is good in some instances, and they more often than not are fine. If they're going to get one shot 100-0, especially like on a frequent cadence, then Elemental starts to get really scared. That's the part where they're like really worried. On top of that, if If they had to press Ankh 15 minutes prior, they have lower HP than they necessarily anticipated, and that also makes them a bit more susceptible, which is a really weird interaction. But this is just like, these are issues once you start to get to like very high keys.
Yeah, like the defensive kit of the Shaman, they have a nice short cooldown wall, powerful wall. But if that is not enough, like you said, if there's a boss that's just gonna like chunk them every 30% for 110% of their health,
I'm thinking like Croth, Gale Arrow, those kind of abilities.
Now we're talking about like some real struggling to stay alive activities. Some like, okay, Prop Paladin is gonna be putting their Word of Glories into me, or like, I'm entering Ghost Wolf 10 seconds before this mechanic, so I've stacked up my DR or whatever.
That sucks. Yes.
Yeah, that is not when you are a happy camper whenever you're having to do that.
And Enhance, kind of similar to 10.0. Enhance, one of the best funnel specs in the game. Their AoE isn't always the best, but at the end of the day, I think that this specialization brings a lot of the similar utility to the Elemental Shaman. On top of that, their funnel is just so good. Their damage seems like it's there again in a way that we haven't seen it in the past. I think that Ellie is going to be like topping meters. I think Enhance is going to be doing a lot of the legwork in your dungeon for killing the priority mob, making sure that thing dies. I will gamble and do the top single target on bosses, because more often than not, Enhance plays builds in M+ that aren't exactly single target focused, but they still tend to be one of the best single target DPSs in M+, because they end up giving up less than most specializations.
Right, exactly. Like in a world where everybody is playing an M+ build, the enhancement M+ build is doing a lot of
exactly.
target.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly what I was trying to say.
I like A for both of these shamans. Let's talk about the warlocks.
Both Demo and Destro are great power infusion recipients. If you watched the raid one, you would probably expect these to be S tier with Shadow Priest. As it currently stands, it seems like they are very good. In addition to that, they're quite solid second DPS options in a lot of spots. For Destro, the reason that I don't have it S is I don't think the pull size in a lot of these dungeons is conducive to have Destro being an S as it currently stands. I don't think their damage is just going to be miles better than other potential options, such as the Fire Mage, such as the Moonkin, such as like even the Dev Evoker for those second DPS spots, even if you are eating the power infusion.
Yeah, you're talking about pull sizing and like, oh yeah, it'd be really good if you were pulling super big for Destro, right? Like,
yes,
but
we need like Alg Academy to come back for them.
Yeah, but like, and even then, like Dev Evoker, Balanced Druid, these specs also love it when you pull super big, right? So I don't think they're opening like huge gaps between them and those specs if you are pulling that big.
But the advantages of playing with the Warlock. So for Destro, one, Blasphemy stuns are absolutely broken. Blasphemy plus Infernal, just free stops on a lot of casts is very nice. If you're playing with a skilled Warlock, they're able to tell you in advance when their Blasphemy is going to be coming down, so you can actually balance that into your rotation. Curse of Tongues and Amp Curse, very, very good in specific circumstances. When it's good, it's quite strong. On top of that, it can change the kick cadence on a lot of mobs. I know in like Noku Defensive, it was a really big deal. I know in Azure Vault, it was a big deal on some mobs as well. That's one of those buttons that if it does change your cadence, it's really good. So for
this
Destro,
is another spec as well that is like kind of a powerhouse at dealing with like incorporeal if you need to, right? You throw a fear
banish
on one of those things and problem solve, very easy to do. You have a lot of those sorts of tools, and also the Imp Dispel is quite nice. It's no Mass Dispel, but if you don't have a Mass Dispel, or even if you do, it can still be nice to have an extra magic dispel coming from your Warlock in dungeons like Halls of Infusion and in Uldaman.
You have that purge from that dog too, the Fell Hunter.
Yeah, that the offensive purge. Again, like we think that a lot of groups are going to have access to one of those already from their Spriest, but if you're not playing one of those, we've got a Spriest at home. It's not quite as good, but still did that.
So for Demo, their damage looks good. I mean, ultimately their damage looks good. It looks like it has the ability to be able to eat power infusion and do fairly solid damage. They did just recently get nerfed with the one of their Tyrant builds that they were playing, so it's slightly less good in the damage department, but ultimately I think it's one of those specs that their damage is still quite potent. It's also a Warlock, which Unending Resolve, 2.5 minute CD if you want it to be is very good, or it could just be better DR. On top of that, you have Dark Pact, which is on a 45-minute CD for whatever reason, and that by itself is enough to allow them to be an A, as they are never going to die. But AF, I got in C. Their damn kind of stinks from what I've seen. What do you think? You think you have any words about AF? It's just like, I think their damage is bad.
I think that the single target side of things outside of like Lust is where you're going to start to feel the difference between having like an AF versus a demo or a Destro as your Warlock spec. Also like the mid-sized pulls, because AF is pretty happy in really big pulls as well. Yeah, again, like I kind of think the spec is another one where it's like maybe if it weren't for Destro and demo, you'd actually be seeing some people playing this and doing pretty well with it. But I do think it's going to be hard to ever choose it over Destro or demo for content next patch.
Okay. Lastly, we have the DPS warriors. And I think that, and this might be a hot take, I think that Fury might be the best melee. Their damage is quite powerful. On top of that, their self-sustain is very good. They don't really die to anything in any capacity. Now, their stops kind of suck. And so their utility department is not the best, especially with Incorporeal and Afflicted. They can stand there and cheer you on as you CC the mobs for them or dispel them. So they don't excel in the CC department or the utility department, but I do think that their damage is definitely one of the better ones from the melee DPS. And so I had Arms in B and Fury in A. What's your read on this generally?
The thing is, I'm a little bit cautious of my intuition here, because that would have kind of been my intuition last season as well. And Arms actually saw like more success in the highest keys than Fury did. So I'm still fine with this. I'm still fine with Fury being the higher one. I do think it looks like it fits a little bit more nicely into M+, but it is worth noting that I thought the same thing last season, and Arms ended up kind of being the actual banger one for the really highest keys, and for the MDI as well. A couple of them showed up there.
I mean, we also saw Fury in some of the highest keys too. There was like a group on NA that played Fury Warrior as opposed to Arms. Like I think they went back and forth between like what spec they ended up playing a little bit. But a situation where I think that DPS Warrior is a solid third slot DPS in a lot of instances, and it can potentially be a second slot. You just need to make sure, again, you have a balanced composition. That's what we're preaching here. Make sure you have a balanced composition. Make sure you're not running into a dungeon with a Priest plus a Moonkid plus a Demonology Warlock or something like that. You might have a bad time.
Yeah, I mean, if you do that, you need the like Paladin Shaman.
You need to know what you're doing. Yeah, you need to really be cautious about doing stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. I think that's going to be it for our 10.1 M+ DPS tier list. Any final thoughts? Anything you think we need to move?
Looks good to me. Hope you enjoyed this video.
Our A tier is stacked.
Don't use it in a way that would be bad, though.
Dude, our A tier is stacked. This is the most stacked I've ever seen it.
Oh yeah, it's again, a lot of credit to Blizzard. M+ has been, I think there's been some patches where M+ is sort of, there's been some broken specs and some specs that have sucked, and they've kind of just left it. This expansion, they've really, so far, I think, been doing a pretty good job of like also balancing M+, which hard to complain about.
Can't complain. Yep, can't complain. All right.
Yeah.
GG's. Goodbye, everybody.
GG.